اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. Tonight, inshallah ta'ala, we continue from where we left off last week in the Tafseer of Juz' of Al-Mufassal from Qaf to An-Nas, and we concluded Surat Al-Talaq last week, and this week we'll start with Surat Al-Tahrim, the final surah in the second cluster. So Al-Mufassal, the comprehensive surahs from Qaf to An-Nas, are divided into four groups, which are basically the four ajza that they belong to. From Qaf to Al-Hadid, we spent a year, maybe and a half, covering that cluster. And then from Mujadala to Al-Tahrim, which is what we're in right now, we're going to be concluding it with Surat Al-Tahrim over the next 3 to 4 weeks. And then after that, we will move on to the third cluster from Mulk to Al-Mursalat, and then Juz' Amma at the end. And each Juz' is basically a group of surahs, and they talk about something different than the other group. And I will provide you with a little bit of a summary towards the end, but this Juz', the cluster that we're in from Mujadala to Al-Tahrim, is an organizational group of surahs. It talks about organizing relationships for Muslims. And all of the surahs are from the Madani period. They were all revealed to the Prophet ﷺ through his time in Medina, when he had built his country, and he had his audience, and he had leadership and authority and autonomy. So Muslims who live in a position or situation where they have that access, they're able to build their own community, and they're able to make their own decisions and have their own form of leadership, then the relationships they have with each other and with others, living with them, or those from without them, are important. And that's what this cluster covered. From Qaf to Al-Hadid, it just talked about the choices. It was very fundamental in terms of the basic beliefs and the requirements, the principles, the values that you have as Muslim. It kept on offered you all these choices, whether you choose between being someone of righteousness versus someone of falsehood, whether you believe in that you have a purpose versus no purpose, guidance versus no guidance, knowledge versus no knowledge, etc., etc. Each surah was just basically offering you two choices, and you were choosing, inshallah, the right one. From Mujadala Tahrim is more organizational. Each surah talking about organizing a different aspect of how the Muslim society functions. And Surah Al-Talaq, which was what we recited over the last 3 to 4 weeks, it talked about matrimony, talked about marriage, hence the name divorce. So it organized the relationships of getting married and divorcing, and what that means. Surah Al-Tahrim, the final surah, and this talks about the relationships, organizing the relationships of family, between spouses and their children, and how houses are going to function, houses. You see, when you get married, you go from being you to being Bayt Fulan, whatever your name is. Even though you don't have children, you just got married, right? You become a house, you become a household. You're no longer just a guy. Like right now, if you're not married, you're just a person, you're azabi, you're single, you're just floating around in the world as an individual. The moment you get married, now you're a household. With or without children doesn't make a difference. If you have children, then great. If no, you're still a house. You're a bayt in Islam. You're called a bayt. This is very important. You're referred to differently. You're seen differently. Now you're actually carrying Islam. You are now carrying the Islamic unit. You are now the basic Islamic unit that builds the Muslim ummah. Once you have that designation of being married. So the relationships that require that exist within this family are important, and that's what this surah is going to talk about. It's going to talk about spouses and their relationship with one another. Surah Al-Talaq is different. Surah Al-Talaq talked about it was focused on the getting married and then getting divorced and the rights that come with that, and that was very technical. So the Tahrim is talking about the relationships that are going to exist within the household, between the spouses, and how that's going to look. And it's a very appropriate topic for this cluster of surahs to end with. If Surah Al-Mujadala was organizing the relationship amongst Muslims within the Muslim country, the broadest of categories, Surah Al-Tahrim at the end is organizing the relationships between the spouses within the household. Because in order for Surah Al-Mujadala to work, which is the relationship amongst Muslims within the country, you need the ones within the household to actually be functional. And subhanAllah, we forget sometimes that the collective is just the reflection of the smaller units that create it. I mean, it sounds like it seems it seems common sense to me, but we don't seem to. I don't know what happens when the moment we zoom out as human beings, we lose we lose track of things really quickly. We understand what it requires to keep a marriage, to keep a family, or to keep a household functional. And when you think about a country, just think of that household times a million. That's all a country is. It's just all these households and how they're going to work with one another and how we're going to make it all function. But when we zoom out, we don't see it that way anymore. We just see people, and we lose the fact that we lose the sight of the fact that really people are just trying to get into relationships, start their own households, and find some degree of stability within that. Then that's all the human being really wants at the end. At least those who are reasonable. So Surat Al-Tahrim is going to talk about some aspects of that. And the first story that we're going to run through, the first 5 verses, which I'm hoping we can get through inshallah today, is an interesting one, and it teaches us a bunch of lessons that hopefully you'll find beneficial. Surat Al-Tahrim, again, one of the late Madani surahs, as the majority of this juz was. Almost all of the surahs, without exception, from Mujadala to Al-Tahrim, were late Madani surahs, maybe with the exception of Jumu'ah, which was not an early one, but an earlier Madani surah. The rest of them were all quite late. Because before he left, alayhi salatu wasalam, before he left us, these surahs came to kind of explain to us what was going to be the requirements of us as Muslims living in communities. Now, I talked about this at the beginning of this cluster, so maybe a year ago now, maybe almost exactly a year ago or a little bit more. And I stopped, and I'll just do a reminder for it today. It is palpably different, and the differences are palpable between how the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba were able to practice these verses versus how we can or will. The main difference being that we don't live in a Muslim state or a majority Muslim country where Muslims are able to organize with one another and make decisions and have some degree of autonomy and have some degree of authority. We don't have that. So when we are practicing the lessons from these surahs, we have to draw analogies with differences. Like we have to be able to account for the differences and the distinctions that exist between my situation today and yours, and the Prophet ﷺ's situation with the Sahaba in Medina, so that we can draw healthy analogies, healthy parallels that allow us to actually benefit from the lessons that are being taught in these surahs. And this is why it's important. This is why knowledge of Islam is important, because there's not a word in the Quran that is not practical. That is not something that we should be practicing. Everything in the Quran is something that we should be practicing. However, what sometimes is missing is the difference of context and then the proper drawing of analogies and with those distinctions. So, and that's where sometimes that's where extremism to a certain degree sometimes comes from. Not amongst the large politically driven extremist groups. No, they have a different agenda altogether. But from individuals. From someone who wasn't very connected to Islam and suddenly decided to become Muslim, or a convert, for example, they accepted Islam, and then they start reading the Quran with no context, with no understanding of this topic, and they go through verses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala command Muslims to stand their ground, to fight those who oppress them, and to bear arms against those who are transgressing against them. If they don't understand that there are differences, there's a context for that verse that you're missing. So to draw the analogy, there's some differences are going to exist. So yes, you're going to fight and stand your ground, just not maybe exactly like the way they're going to do it, or the way that they did it, because of the context that they had that we don't. You cannot, for example, bear arms in Islam if you're not a part of a country, a functional country that has an army. You're absolutely not allowed to bear arms unless you're a part of that army. If they don't want you in that army, you're not allowed to bear arms and go running. I want to respond. No. It has to be properly organized. So for an individual to decide on their own they're going to bear arms and go fight, that absolutely makes zero sense. It has no precedence in Islamic law. It is fully forbidden, and the person can be, under Islamic law, executed for even doing that, because you're terrorizing a society and you're not allowed to do it. So if you don't understand that when you read the verses, then you'll be confused, because you don't have the proper knowledge to understand the context for these verses, which is why it's important to learn your deen. The Quran was purposefully revealed to the Prophet ﷺ throughout his life, addressing his life, so that we have a pragmatic text amongst us or in our hands that we are capable of learning life lessons from. You don't learn, and you're not willing even to read constitutions that are. How many people have actually read the constitution of any given country? I can bet you and I don't have to bet you because they did this, by the way, in 2006 or 7, where they asked the Congress people how many of them actually read the Constitution. It was less than 15% of people. No one reads something that boring. Article 1, Section A, B. If you're not a lawyer who's going to make money off doing this by defending someone, or you need that information to be able to argue your case, you're not going beyond number 1, Section A, then you're good. You're good. You're good. You want someone can come and tell you where do I stand in the law. I don't want to read, because it's very, the Quran purposefully by Allah was not put that way. The Quran was not here. Number 1, Aqidah, Iman. Section 1, belief in Allah. Section 2, no. The Quran didn't do that. Quran went through things in a very dynamic manner. Just very dynamically talked about stories. It's very well organized, which is what I'm trying to explain to you through these sessions. That the Quran is meticulously and miraculously organized. Amazingly organized. Every surah and every cluster has things it's talking about. Right? It's just done in a way that's very dynamic. Instead of being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, A, B, C, D, it's done in a bit more dynamic manner, so that you are more likely to enjoy and reflect and contemplate what you're reading, rather than getting bored out when it's a bit too technical. But the Quran is very well organized. Every group of surahs talks about a specific topic, and then the topic is looked at from different angles, each surah taking a different angle. So it's very well put together. It's just a matter of you being able to see that, and also appreciating the fact that the dynamic aspect of the verses is there to feed and to aid your interest and your ability to stay connected to what you're listening to. Meaning all these lessons could have just been offered in a very dry manner. Speak like this, don't speak like that, think like this when you speak, make sure you take that, which we do, which is what I have to do, but I have to decipher that for you. But when you read the Quran, you get to read this amazing story. Like what we're going to read tonight is a really interesting story. It's a fun story to listen to, and to know the details. You'll be picking up your own little gems as you go along, and still learning from the basic moral of the story. And that's just the beauty of having this book amongst us. So we'll start with that, inshallah. We'll start with the first verse of Surat Al-Tahrim, and we'll begin with the tafsir. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها النبي لم تحرم ما أحل الله لك. So it's lima tuharrimu. You can see the lam with the kasra and the mim with a fatha. It's not lima, so there's no alif after it, so don't give it a long. يا أيها النبي لم تحرم. Okay. تبتغي مرضات أزواجك. والله غفور رحيم. قد فرض الله لكم تحلة أيمانكم. So the word is tahillata, all right? The word is tahillata aymanikum. And I'll explain what it means in a moment. وَاللَّهُ مَوْلَاكُمْ وَهُوَ الْعَلِيمُ الْحَكِيمُ. So let's give you some context here. So the Prophet ﷺ, as a man, married one lady. He married Khadija radiallahu anha wa alayhi salam. He only married her, and he stayed with her for 25 full years. And after she passed away, he stayed for 5 to 6 years with no marriage. And then once he finally married, he married Sauda bin Zam'a radiallahu anha, who was 85 years old, the first widow within Islam. And it was years later until 2 years later before he married Aisha, and then Hafsa, and then Zainab, and then Juwayriya, and then Safiya, and on and on. Muhammad, the Prophet ﷺ, married multiple wives. Those wives he married ﷺ because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded him to do so. Marry fulana, marry fulana, marry fulana. What he ended up doing ﷺ with these marriages is he tied the ropes of all of the Arabs and all of the Abrahamic faiths together. So all of Arabia were brought in. He married women from different tribes. And he married Safiya, who was from the Jewish background, and Maria al-Qibtiyya, who was Christian. He married these ladies, and he brought together the house of Abraham, basically, and the house of Arabia at the time. And that was of importance, because these ladies were called Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, the mothers of believers. They had religious immunity, they had political immunity, and they had social immunity. Right? They had full immunity, meaning you couldn't touch them. And this was unprecedented. Aisha led an army for the first time in history. Now you could argue that maybe her choice of the side was not correct, but if you ignore the details of the disagreements, which you're supposed to as a Muslim you're not supposed to dive into the details of why Ali and Zubayr and Talha and why they got it. That's none of our business. Like they disagreed on whatever they thought was important at the time. We leave that to them. It's something that we didn't have to get in. We weren't there for it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not hold us accountable to be involved in, so we talk about. But you can learn from the actual lessons that Aisha actually headed an army. Never before in history did a woman ever do that. So these ladies carried value for women after Islam, after the Prophet ﷺ passed away. What was most likely going to happen after he passed away, ﷺ, that people were going to regress immediately to how they were before. This is what happens. Whenever the core leader goes away, all of the values that he came and he specifically changed for people, the majority will just regress the moment he's gone. An example of that was zakah. Zakah was a big deal. Zakah was not enjoyed by the Arab. They didn't like that at all. Especially the fact that it was going to be centralized, meaning the actual Khilafah, the Khalifa, was going to bring the zakah. He was actually you're going to show him what you have. You have to have a spreadsheet of what you own and how much of that is sitting down for a year, and then how much you're going to pay zakah for, and then that's going to be taken to the center, and then they're going to distribute it amongst the different people all over. They didn't like that piece. That was too much. That was too invasive. They didn't like it. So the moment he passed away, alayhi sallam, they're like, nope, we do our own zakah. They didn't say they didn't want to do zakah, by the way. They didn't say we're not going to give zakah. No, they said we're just not going to give it to you. Like we gave it to Muhammad alayhi sallam, he's the Prophet. Abu Bakr, we're not giving it to you. We'll take care of it. Abu Bakr goes, no, that's not how this works. This whole country is built on the centralizing the finances. You need to bring it in. So he fought them, radiallahu anhu. So it's normal for people to regress after the core leader leaves, right? So one of the things that they were going to, and they did regress, was women's rights, which is why you have all these verses. Having 9 to 10 ladies after he passed away, alayhi salam, named Ummahat, the mothers of believers, who no one could touch religiously, meaning whatever she did religiously was going to be seen as fiqh. If this is how Salama prayed, that was now fiqh. Meaning you're going to learn that, write it down, and to become something that scholars are going to be taught after. They became the source of knowledge. They were immune politically, so you could not put them in jail. You could not punish them. They could not be held accountable. You couldn't do anything. They could not be held accountable for anything. And they're immune socially. You can't marry them after him, alayhi salatu wasalam, so that as a way to sideline them. So that became very, very valuable to the ladies afterwards. And it's why scholarship actually continued, because a lot of the tabi'een were educated by Aisha and by Salama and by Hafsa. They were educated by them, and the women were educated by them as well. So there was a shift in the nature of the women's society in Arabia after the Prophet ﷺ did this, because these ladies were beacons of knowledge that other ladies went to learn from, and now women were much more educated than they were before. You're talking about a good chunk of a millennium before that, where women not only were they not educated, or were they not taught to read and write, they were treated like furniture, and they were inherited like you inherit anything else. And this change that the Prophet ﷺ brought to the community to the Arab society was very severe. That's why last week I showed you, we recited basically four or five verses of just very intense reminders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of punishment, of severe punishment for those who don't follow the teachings of Surat Al-Talaq. All of the teachings of Surat Al-Talaq are there to protect the woman from the oppression of the man when divorce happens. Because when divorce happens, the majority of the time, the man would have the upper hand to oppress the lady. It wasn't that difficult. He could easily hold back the finances. He could kick her out of the house. There's a lot of, if she's pregnant, he could leave her. It becomes very oppressive. So these verses were there to scare, to make people had some reverence and some fear that you were not to do this. And then Surat Al-Tahrim is similar. It's going to teach us how the relationships are supposed to be. But the reason I'm saying this at the beginning is that you have to understand that there's context for why the Prophet ﷺ had different wives. I want to get this out of the way so that you can enjoy this story. Because if you don't understand this, then you'll continue to listen to the story and they'll be sticking in your mind. The Prophet ﷺ was not someone who had a high interest in women. How do you know that? Because the first contact he had with a woman in his life, ﷺ, was he was 25. And that's not today, in 2024, that's back then, when people got married when they were 11 and 10 years old. Right? My grandfather married when he was 13 years old. My great-grandfather, my dad's dad, he was 13, my grandmother was 14. It's totally normal in most of the world outside of the bubble of North America and parts of Europe. Very normal. Back at the Prophet ﷺ's time, they married very young. But he didn't, because he was an orphan. He couldn't afford it, and he didn't want to burden himself and burden his uncle. He wanted to help his uncle with his household, so he worked and he practiced celibacy. Full chastity until he was 25. When he was 25, he married Khadija, and he stayed married only to her. No one else. There was no other woman in his life, for 25 years. Until he was 50. And then after that, for 3 years, after she passed away. And then he married Sauda, who was 85. And then for another year, that's it, until you don't decide that you're interested in women at 55 years of age. That's not when it kicks in. If you're a womanizer, it kicks in at the age of 16 or 15. And it continues for the rest of your life. It doesn't kick in at 55. That doesn't exist. And if it does kick in at 55, there's evidence of it happening before. Like, it's biphasic. If it's going to be late, it's going to be biphasic, meaning this person was a womanizer in their 20s, and they calmed down for a while, and they came back in their 50s. But you don't spend a lifetime of chastity, and then it kicks in in your 50s. That's number one. That's an important piece. The second aspect is the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't go around marrying women based on the merit of their beauty. That wasn't what so if it was, then all of his wives would have been in their 20s, and they were the prettiest women of their... No, he married, most of them were widows, most of them were divorcees, most of them were much older, and they came from the pattern that you see. See, it's all about patterns. If the pattern is that they're all in their 20s and they were all bikr, abkar, they were never married before, and they were all the prettiest women of their... Then you have a pattern there, But the pattern is not... The pattern is that they come from every major tribe in Arabia. That's the pattern. The pattern is that they come from all the major tribes that were continuously fighting. And the Prophet ﷺ marrying into that tribe may calm things down, and now they were much more comfortable being Muslim. It's how marriage was seen for a very long time throughout the world. And the Prophet ﷺ, with that, not only did he strengthen Islam, he empowered these ladies, and he empowered women after. He made sure that the regression back to Jahiliyyah ways of treating women didn't happen because of the fact that he married these women, because they continued to advocate for that until they passed away. Radiallahu anhunna ajma'in. All right. So that's kind of the context so that you understand why he has wives. Now, the only one that he married that was very young, and that was a bikr, never married, was Aisha. And Aisha radiallahu anha has the upper hand within Islamic history to have said whatever she wanted to say. Like, if she was abused, or if this was somehow unfair, or if this was mistreatment, or if she hated what happened, she had full religious, social, and political immunity. Once he passed away, alayhi sallam, she could have said whatever she wanted to say. And she could have put within what she said small things for us to figure out that she was not happy with that. Right? She had the ability to do that. Not only did she not, the majority of ahadith that we have about the beauty of his character, alayhi sallam, come from her. Like the majority, as in 90% of the ahadith that I have, talk about the beauty of his character, his generosity, his kindness, his tenderness, his perseverance, and his patience, that come from Aisha's records. Like what she observed and what she lived with, radiallahu anha. Because she was married young, she memorized everything. She knew every aspect about his life, alayhi sallam. She offered us a gold mine of information about him, alayhi sallam. Like so important, every detail about, like, in terms of even what type of water cup he would drink with, what did the pillow look like, what did the seating in his house look like, what did he wear, what were the colors that he wore, how did he, like the details of the little details about a person that you can only know if you've been married them for a long time, Aisha offered to us. Some of the details that sometimes you read them, like, we don't narrate them publicly because they're very, very personal, and I feel embarrassed to narrate them publicly. But if you go and study books of hadith, you'll find personal aspects that she narrates from the relationship she had with him, alayhi salam, for us to learn about how he was as a husband and as a human being, and of course for us to learn how she was as a wife as well. Radiallahu anha warḍah. Now, the story that we have that we're going to, after this long introduction for you. One of the Prophet ﷺ's wives purchased or was gifted a jar of honey. And the Prophet ﷺ loved asal. He loved it. So because she had asal, throughout a certain week, he would stop by her place to have some asal. That's it, just to take a little bit of asal and chat with her. Hafsa, Aisha didn't like it. They didn't like it. They started talking amongst each other. He's stopping there too many times. So they said, this is what we're going to do. When he comes to your house, tell him, قال إذا أتاك رسول الله عليه الصلاة والسلام فأخبريه أنك تجدين منه ريحة مغافير. Tell him that you find bad breath. Maghafir is a type of plant that has a bad scent to it, that sometimes bees will eat, and then the honey will smell like it. All right, so there's a lot of different types of honey. Honey is, asal is based, the texture of it and the taste of it and the scent of it is based on whatever the bees are using. So if you just throw white sugar for the bees, then you get crappy asal that is completely useless. Like you have to have access to certain types of variety. Actually, so it's the versatility and the variety of what they have access to. But there are certain types of plants that if the bees fed on those more than others, then the honey would have a specific scent to it. Now, the honey he was eating from alayhi salam didn't. It wasn't like that. They just made this up. They just basically diabolically planned something to hinder him going daily to Sayyidah Zainab radiallahu anha's house. So Aisha and Hafsa, they agreed they would say this. So Hafsa, he came to Hafsa first. She said that. So he didn't. He said, all right, fair. And then he goes to Aisha, or the opposite. He says Aisha first, then Hafsa, and they both say it to him. When they both say it to him, he says, okay, I'll never eat from it again. He swears, I'll never eat from it again. If he, alayhi salatu, was the type of person, see, they knew him well. They knew him that if they said, you have bad breath because of this, he wouldn't eat anymore. He was someone who cared for his hygiene, alayhi salatu, on a very high level. Like at a time where people didn't, if you leave Canada and some parts of Europe and you go to any part of the world, the personal hygiene care kind of drops really quickly, especially oral hygiene, like really quickly. Like very quickly. You'll see something that like, this is very different. Like I don't understand. So, and this is today where we have access to a lot, to a lot of tools. Back then, they didn't have access to stuff. The Prophet ﷺ actually came up with the concept of the miswak. If you think about it, he invented something, alayhi salatu wasalam. He invented the miswak, and it became a part of the ritual to clean your teeth, so that you didn't, your teeth didn't look disgusting, and you didn't smell, and you didn't have rotting food in your mouth all the time. So he cared for his hygiene a lot, alayhi salatu wasalam. When it came to his body and the odor of his personal odor, his breath, he cared about these things. Another reason is just it kind of yunaji al-wahy, alayhi salatu wasalam. He was someone who spoke to Jibreel. وَإِنَّ الْمَلَائِكَةَ تَتَأَذَّى مِمَّا يَتَأَذَّى مِنْهُ بَنُو آدَمَ. And the malaika are bothered by these things like the human being is. So the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't eat, for example, raw garlic, right? He would stay away from raw garlic and raw onions, because when you eat them, and you blow on someone or you burp, you cause a public health hazard, and people wish they never met you. It becomes so. Prophet ﷺ, whenever he brought food and he smelled raw onion or raw garlic, he just wouldn't eat. He would eat around it, wouldn't touch it, because he didn't want to bother Jibreel. It doesn't mean it's harm for you to eat. It just means that be careful when you do, and you end up coming especially in Ramadan. I have to say this. In Ramadan, please, it's important for the sister who's cooking to take into consideration if her husband and if she is going to pray in the masjid with people. If you're praying at home, then God bless you. Eat whatever you want. Whatever you want. Pour all the spices of India into your food and eat it. That's fine. But if you're coming to the masjid, keep that in mind, that you're coming to a masjid. Everything you eat, it doesn't immediately leave. So you have it at Maghrib. By Isha, your stomach is still basically processing this stuff. So you're carrying a lot of gases that don't all go and sit in the colon quietly until you're done your salah. Some of them come up the other way. The stuff that come up the other way will not just be concise to the area that you're sitting in. It's not confined to the area where you are. It's going to spread into all the directions around you. So people are bothered by this, and I've seen things happen in my life. I grew up in Saudi, and I've seen things happen where people have almost blacked out. Wallahi, someone burps, and another person honestly has to get out of the masjid and go vomit. You have to be very careful with what you eat, and then how you actually come to the masjid afterwards. And that goes. I'm not talking about any specific background here at all. Honestly, it doesn't matter. If you're putting garlic and you're putting onion and a lot of spice in your food, regardless of whether it's Arab, Middle Eastern, or it's the South Indian continent, it doesn't make a difference. You have to be careful, especially when you're coming from Ramadan, for Taraweeh afterwards, which is why I tell everybody, have a very light futur, come pray Taraweeh, and then have your futur after, and then go to sleep. And that way you eat less, and you're able to pray. Because if you want to pray, you can't pray with a full stomach. And even if you can pray with a full stomach, the person beside you is not going to enjoy praying with you with a full stomach. So just keep that in mind. So the Prophet ﷺ heard, two people told him, bad breath from this maghafir. It smells like maghafir. They didn't say, are you eating honey? No. They thought it was true. They didn't say anything about the honey. They acted like they had no idea he was eating honey. They said, by the way, we're smelling rihat maghafir from you. So the Prophet ﷺ said, well, I'm eating honey from someone, so I'm never going to do it again. And he swore that he wouldn't do it again. Because he didn't want to bother his wives or bother him. So the Quran came. The Quran was written. Ya ayyuhan nabi, O Prophet, lima tuharrimu. Why are you forbidding yourself? Ma ahalla Allahu lak. From what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made halal for you. Tabtaghi mardata azwajik. You are seeking the satisfaction of your wives by doing so. Does this mean that you should not do anything to seek the satisfaction of your wife? If that's what you understood, good luck for the rest of your life. If that's what you understood from me today, I bid you farewell and I wish you the best. Come back when you figured out that you misunderstood what I'm saying, and then we can talk. You can continue to listen to me. What this is talking about actually is an extremely, extremely important aspect of the relationship between spouses. When you, as a spouse, decide to remove something from your life that you don't need to remove, that is unnecessary for you, that's not haram, that's not harmful, that you like for someone else, for your spouse's satisfaction, this is where resentment begins. This is the seed of it. Sometimes very, very small, it's just a speck, but it will grow with time. You see, when you're married, you're going to be stuck with this family for a very long time. So what may be very small at the first day will turn into a huge problem 10, 15 years down the road. What the Prophet ﷺ did here is that he forbade himself from doing something he liked, that was halal, that was not actually bothersome, there was no necessity for him stopping not to do this ﷺ anymore, for someone else's satisfaction. This was going to ruin the relationship. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, don't, go ahead, you don't do it for that. You are going to compromise your marriage a lot. But when you compromise throughout your marriage, the compromise has to be something that makes sense. There has to be, the parameters for the compromise within a marriage has to be something that is sensible, or else it is the seed of resentment. It will start very, very slowly, but within time, you will start to resent the other person, because certain things in your life that were beneficial to you, that you loved, that were not problematic, you let go, and you lost that part of yourself, or you're not doing. And you will notice that later on, and you will resent the reason that you stopped doing it, which will end up being the spouse, so it's an unnecessary compromise. It's not that important. It shouldn't happen. In this story here, this is what happened. For them, they just there was no real reason. There was no scent. There was actually no, he didn't have bad breath, alayhi salatu wasalam. They just didn't like something he was doing. So they came up with a different story for him to do it. So he immediately said, okay, حرام علي, I won't touch it anymore. The second verse, قَدْ فَرَضَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ تَحِلَّةَ أَيْمَانِكُمْ. Indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made obligatory for you. تَحِلَّةَ أَيْمَانِكُم is the way for you to remove the oath from yourself. To absolve yourself from an oath, there's a way to do it. So if you make an oath, أقسم بالله, I'm going to do this, and then you don't do it, then you have to absolve yourself from that oath. لا يؤاخذكم الله باللغو في أيمانكم ولكن يؤاخذكم بما عقدتم الأيمان فكفارته إطعام 10 مساكين من أوسط ما تطعمون أهليكم أو كسوتهم أو تحرير رقبة فمن لم يجد فصيام 3 أيام. So when you break an oath, you feed 10 miskin. It adds up to what today? Maybe $200 or something like that, maybe more, maybe $300 to 10 miskin. And if you can't afford that, then you fast 3 days. You can't free slaves anymore because alhamdulillah there's none left. Well, none in the context of this ayah, but you can fast 3 days, right? So if you ever make an oath and you want to break the oath and you move on to something different, then that's what you do. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet, قَدْ فَرَضَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made obligatory for you. تَحِلَّةَ أَيْمَانِكُمْ, absolving yourself from your oaths that you should not make. وَاللَّهُ مَوْلَاكُمْ وَهُوَ الْعَلِيمُ الْحَكِيمُ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is your Lord, or as your caregiver, or as the one who looks over you. وَهُوَ الْعَلِيمُ الْحَكِيمُ, and He is the all-wise, and He is the omniscient, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So He told the Prophet ﷺ to break this oath. Break this oath, go back and enjoy what you were doing. And the reason being, for this point, to be clear for spouses, because I find it to be one of the most repetitive source of problems amongst married people to be these things. When she gave up or he gave up something that he never felt or she never felt they had to give up. And when you give up something like that, that you feel is essential to you, is important to you, and the reasoning for why you gave it up is not reasonable, it doesn't make any sense, it was not something that was a necessity, with time that will cause you to have bad feelings towards the other person. And that's why we talk a lot about, when it comes to marriage, to have discussions up front with your spouse about how you see life functioning when you get married. How is this going to work? Because as you talk about these things, you will say things to each other. You will hear what she has to say, she'll hear what you have to say. And you'll run into points where there may be very different expectations. And when those expectations are made clear, that they're different, it gives the person space to decide whether they're willing to give this up or not give this up, or whether there's a middle ground for us to meet regarding what we're going to do moving forward. Because if not, and someone has to give that up, if there's no middle ground, and one of the two parties has to give something up that they don't want to give up, and they have to let go of something they don't want to let go of, it's a seed, it's just a beginning, it's a spot of resentment that will later on, turn into something else. Later, it'll turn into something very, very problematic later. The problem is not trying to satisfy your spouse. تبتغي مرضات أزواجك. There's nothing wrong with that. It's تحريم ما أحل الله. That's the problem. If you go to Surat Al-A'raf, قل من حرم زينة الله التي أخرج لعباده والطيبات من الرزق قل هي للذين آمنوا في الحياة الدنيا خالصة يوم القيامة. Say, who dares make the adornments of life that Allah made halal, who dares make them haram? The adornments, the zina, the extra stuff. Not talking about the essentials, talking about the extra stuff, the extra beauties, the luxuries of life that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put here on earth halal. Who dares make them haram? Yeah. Say that they are for the believers in this dunya and the disbelievers, and then they're for the believers only on the day of judgment. Everyone gets to enjoy them in this dunya, and then the halal, obviously, the halal luxuries and the halal zina, not the haram ones. So the tahrim of halal, scholars, if you go study usul al-fiqh, and I teach this in the courses of usul al-fiqh that I teach here, tahrim al-halal is equal, if not worse, than tahleel al-haram. For you to make something halal haram is equal, if not worse, than making something haram halal. Yeah? And this is something that the scholars of usul al-fiqh have talked about for centuries and argued back and forth. And I tend to agree with this statement because I've seen the effect of tahrim al-halal. Of just closing the doors on everything that's halal and what it leads to. It may at the moment seem safe, but in the long run it causes a complete flood of the gates. It's a complete flooding of the gates happens. Like tahleel haram is a problem for a short period of time, because once you make something haram halal, within a little bit of time the effects of that will become obvious. Haram is always harmful. Just leave it for a bit, the filth of haram will become clear, and the people who were fooled by this will pull back within a short period of time, because it's hard to miss. But when you make something halal haram, you don't see the effect immediately. No. The effect, you don't see an effect. For a while you don't see an effect. It takes a couple of years and maybe a few generations. You'll make enough halal things haram until a group of people or a generation comes and says, this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous, I can't do anything. Everything I want to do is haram. Go here, haram. Sit there, haram. Talk to this person, haram. Or turn on this, haram. Everything's haram. Hil anni. Take your haram and go do your, I don't care anymore. So, and it floods the gates. And then we go, because we didn't understand that the word haram means in Islam, what does it mean in Arabic? Anyone know? What does the word haram mean? Sacred. It means sacred. Before it means forbidden, which is what we use, it's sacred. The word is holy, it's sacred. So anything that we call haram, which is forbidden, it has to, the source of making it forbidden has to be sacred. That's why it's called forbidden. Who's going to call this action here haram? The Holy One. Al-Qayyum, Al-Quddus subhanahu wa ta'ala can call that haram. No one else can, because it's a big deal. Because it's a big deal to tell people no. Who has the right to come and tell you can't do this? Who has the right to do that? No one does. You're an adult. No one has the right to come and tell you what you can and cannot do. This is your life. You do it. So the fact that you're accepting that this is haram, you're saying, I'm not doing that because who? Because who said? Because the sheikh? No. Sheikh doesn't matter. Sheikh is nothing. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it's haram. And that's sacred. There's holiness to that. So when you start allowing other things to take away those halals for you, it causes an imbalance. It causes an imbalance in your mind. And it begins because you're like, why am I not doing this? Well, I've always enjoyed that. Like a guy gets married, for example, and then for the sake of his wife, he stops hanging out with his friends, or he stops going playing a sport, or he stops, and he's like, well, you don't have to stop doing these things. There's no reason for it. Now, you have to be smart with your time management. You have to make sure that she's getting enough time with you and that you're taking care of her and her children and her household and you're spending quality time and that is obvious, but you don't have to take away aspects of your life that you were living before. And if you do for her, it's a matter of time before the man becomes resentful. Same thing goes for the sister. Same thing. Same thing goes for the sister. If she gets married and for him, she loses contact with her family. She doesn't see them as much. She loses contact with her siblings. She's not able to continue her education. She's not able to continue. She will resent him. She'll resent him for it. Right? So this is why these things are important. When you have access to the halal of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you unnecessarily are not allowed access to it just to please the other party in your family, you may do it up front because you love them. See, the Prophet ﷺ was a very selfless person. Whatever made people happy, he didn't mind. He didn't mind. For him, it didn't matter. He didn't care about honey that much. He enjoyed it. It didn't matter to him, ﷺ. It makes you happy, tikram aynik. We don't do it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came and said, no. Don't teach them to do this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is intervening so that the Prophet ﷺ does not teach us to do that. Are you understanding what's happening here? This is his choice, alayhi salatu. He said, no, whatever makes her happy. So Allah said, no. Don't teach them to do that. That's not helpful for them. Not because the concept is don't satisfy your wife. No. Or don't look for her pleasure. Of course you are. It's just if you do it this way, your followers won't do well. They're not like you because alayhi salatu he was different. For him, he was someone who had a certain degree of zuhd and a certain degree of wara, certain degree of asceticism in his life where he didn't really care for any of this stuff. It didn't make a difference for him at all. His wives could barely keep up with the level of piety and minimalism that he lived. So for him, it's no big deal. Right? But for me and you, if we're going to learn this from him, that whatever, I can afford to lose aspects of my life, compromise aspects of my life that are natural, that are not problematic, for the preference of someone else in an unnecessary manner, that is a problem. When men ask for it, it causes problems for the women, and when women ask for it, it causes problems for men. And this is something that has to be thought about within the household. Think about these things in the household when you're married. When you have kids and you have a household, think very what you don't want them to leave things for you, by the way. It's not in your best interest for her to stop doing something she enjoys for you. No. You understand the responsibility that comes with that? You understand the burden that you're carrying? She stopped doing that for you? Ya Habibi, how are you going to live your life? Now you owe her now more than you can ever owe. And the same thing goes the other way. When you ask him to live differently, to remove the halal that he has, you're going to have to deal with something that's going to be difficult later on because it's just a matter of time. SubhanAllah, as human beings, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's best for us. When you think about the story, why would this happen? Why would this ayah even exist? Like, there's an Orientalist scholar who would, obviously don't believe in the Prophet ﷺ altogether, but they would read and they would say, we don't understand why this would be in the Quran. Like if he's making it up, he actually made up verses just so he could eat some more honey. Like they made more sense. Like why would he? You're running a whole ummah. You're going to make up Quran just to get extra honey? No, it doesn't make any sense at all. Like if you're going to bring a verse in, it should be to change a huge aspect of your life that is bothering you, not because you wanted to eat a little bit. It doesn't make no sense in it. So they would read it, they wouldn't understand, why is this here? Why is Muhammad exposing aspects of his personal life? Why is he doing this? It makes no. Well, it's because it's not him, alayhi salatu wasalam, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. Then so you come to, well, why is Allah intervening in this story altogether? It's just something simple. A wife didn't want him to do something, so she made up a story so he wouldn't do it, and he said, Tikram ainik, I won't do it. And Allah said, no, don't do it like that. Please her, not like that though. That is not healthy. It's not healthy for her to do that. It's not healthy for you to do it. So find another way. So take your oath back, go pay the miskeen, assume the days, eat your honey, figure out another way to do this. Don't do it that way. Because Al-Alim, that's why the ayah is وَهُوَ الْعَلِيمُ الْحَكِيمُ. He's the omniscient, He's the all-wise. He knows. He knows what works for you and what doesn't. This doesn't work for you. This way of life is not healthy. You're not going to be happy. Neither of you will be happy at the end. Neither of you at the end will be happy. And the problem is every married person here knows exactly what I'm talking about. If you're not married, you're basically just listening to gibberish. You'll understand later. But every married person knows the things that they gave up when they got married, that they now regret giving up front, and the stuff that they made the other person give up, that other person keeps on reminding them that they made them give up, and they don't want to hear that anymore. If they have to hear it again, they want to slam their face into a wall. And they remember the fact that, and it all comes from lack of wisdom up front. A little bit of lack of wisdom up front of what is, and that's why good social compatibility, proper discussions up front will make it easy for us not to run into these type of problems later on in marriage. So that's the first, those are the first two verses, that's the first lesson that we have. So let's recite the third one. And it's the same story, it's just the nature of the lesson is a little bit different, so we'll talk about it inshallah. وَإِذْ أَسَرَّ النَّبِيُّ إِلَى بَعْضِ أَزْوَاجِهِ حَدِيثًا فلما نبأت به وأظهره الله عليه So فلما نبأت به. So this ayah we're going to have like words that are similar and going to be repeating each other as we go along. So just pay attention. So the first one فلما نبأت به وأظهره الله عليه. All right. عرف بعضه وأعرض عن بعض. فلما نبأها به قالت من أنبأك هذا قال نبأني العليم الخبير. All right. So the Prophet ﷺ, he told Hafsa, after she said, she was a second person, just so I got this story straight for you. She was a second wife who told him that your breath smells. He said, I will not ever, this is what I've been doing. I've been going. He didn't know at the time that they had plotted, right? He didn't know. He's like, oh, so what I've been doing is I've been stopping by at Zainab's. She has some asal and I've been eating from it. It must be from maghafir. That's why. So, and I won't eat that anymore. But just don't say this to anyone. Don't talk about this to anyone, because I won't eat there anymore. حرمت على نفسي. You took an oath you wouldn't eat. Just don't say this anymore. So what did she do? She went and told Aisha. It worked. They talked about it, and then they talked about it amongst the other wives. They had a discussion about it. So when the Quran was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, so it's interesting here because you have to think about this from the perspective of Hafsa and Aisha. And Sayyidina al-Khattab is the one who tells us this story because he would say, it's my daughter who's involved in this story here, so he would like to tell the story. So what the ayahs are saying, and I want you to think about this because it's very interesting if you put yourself in the shoes or in the position of Aisha and Hafsa. With asarra an-nabiyyu, asarra is when you say something in secret, in confidence. You say something confidentially. With أسر النبي إلى بعض أزواجه حديثا. And when the Prophet, and the instant where the Prophet, this is what the ayah is saying, told one of his wives something confidentially. The Quran didn't point out Hafsa, right? And the Quran does that. The Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, the adab, is that when someone makes a mistake, you don't name them. Like when a Muslim makes a mistake, you don't name them out. You don't call them out by name. You just, if they do something well, good, you call them out. But you find this all throughout the Sunnah of the Prophet. If someone did something wrong, they would say, قَامَ رَجُلٌ جَاءَ رَجُلٌ ذَهَبَ. A man did this. Even though they knew who it was, but they don't narrate it by the name because they don't want to shame the person who made the mistake. If it's a good thing, they'll point out the person who did it. And that's just the adab. So the Quran similarly doesn't point out who it is. Umar said it's Hafsa. But honestly, it could be. I don't know. The Quran didn't say because the Quran wasn't interested in actually pointing out the mistake of the person. It was more the incident and what needed to be learned from it. So وَإِذْ أَسَرَّ النَّبِيُّ إِلَى بَعْضِ أَزْوَاجِهِ, one of his wives, haditha, something verbal, confidential. فَلَمَّا نَبَّأَتْ بِهِ, and when she went and she talked about it, he asked her not to say it, to keep it confidential. She went and she talked about it. وَأَظْهَرَهُ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showed him all of this. I mean, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explained, and Jibreel came and said, this is what happened. عَرَّفَ بَعْضَهُ وَأَعْرَضَ عَنْ بَعْضٍ. The Prophet ﷺ, what did he do? Once the Jibreel came and told him, Ya Rasulullah, this is what happened. They plotted. They knew that you were doing this. They plotted just to get you to stop doing it. So you did it. So don't go back and break your oath, make up for it and do it. And she, after you asked them not to talk about this and just to keep it confidential, they talked about it. So the Prophet ﷺ, what did he do? عَرَّفَ بَعْضَهُ وَأَعْرَضَ عَنْ بَعْضٍ. He exposed the fact that he knew some of it, عَرَّفَ بَعْضَهُ, and then he ignored the rest of it. So he didn't come to Hafsa and tell her, by the way, I know the whole thing. He just came and told her that next time don't spread something that I talked to you about in confidence. If I ask you to keep something a secret, don't talk about it to someone else. He didn't bring up the fact that he knew that they had came up with this little plot, she and Aisha. He didn't say, أَعْرَضَ عَنْ بَعْضٍ. He ignored that piece. He didn't even bring it up. The only way that Hafsa and Aisha knew that the Prophet ﷺ knew that about their plot is from the Quran. Like Aisha and Hafsa found out that the Prophet ﷺ knew about their plot when they were praying Isha behind him one night when he was reading Surat Al-Tahrim. That's how they knew. Like, as far as they knew, the Prophet ﷺ had no knowledge of this. He just found out that they were talking about it, even though he asked them to keep this confidential. I don't want this, don't talk to anyone about this, because they talked about it and Zainab heard. And she got upset because he wasn't coming anymore. So it caused a little bit of fight. Then he asked him, don't talk about this. So he called Hafsa and he said, if you want me to trust you, and this is an important piece, another lesson, the importance of confidentiality. And it goes both ways, obviously. The story here is not a man to woman, it's the Prophet ﷺ and his spouse, so it goes in both ways. The importance of confidentiality. What happens inside your house? Ya akhi wa ya ukhti. If you are married, fix your problems within the household. Talk about it amongst the two of you. Do not bring in people to help you, because the majority of people that you'll bring in to help you will not help you. They have their own agenda, especially if you bring in parents. Ya akhi, don't bring it. It's very hard. Like most of the parents that you'll bring in, the amount of problems that this causes on a daily basis is honestly mind-boggling, especially from the sister side. Now, what a sister needs to know when she gets married is when the man is behaving in a way that is abusive. That's what in my opinion, that's what a woman should be. A girl should be educated before she gets married, to know what abuse is, so that she doesn't have no definition for it, so she gets abused and she doesn't say anything, nor that she has an extremely left oriented definition where anything that they disagree upon is now abuse, so they're going to be fighting all the time. She needs a proper definition of abuse so that she can point it out when it happens, because that's important. She has to let her family members and her people know. But when anything that's not abuse, figure it out with your husband. Figure it out. Don't bring your mother into this. Right? Allah yajziha al-khair al-hajji. She's a nice lady. May Allah bless her. She's a great lady. Don't bring her into this problem. You will make her hate her son-in-law. You bring your father, is even worse. Wallahi, the number of marriages that I've seen ruined, not by the spouses, but by the people they thought were wise to come and help them fix their problems. Like, they were naive. They said, well, I have a problem. I'll go to the fulana, my mother or my father. The number of marriages I've seen completely been torn to pieces. Not because the two spouses didn't want it to work, but because the parents became extremely arrogant and became very self-conscious, and they couldn't see. Keep your household secrets confidential. Talk about it amongst yourselves. Figure things out, the two of you. This is how it's supposed to happen. And if something is a secret, then keep the secret. You have to be able to. Keeping the secret of your spouse is extremely important. It's a very important part of being married, of having a household, is being able to keep al-buyut asrar. Households are filled with secrets. You have to hold on to them. Don't share it with a friend. Don't share it with a family. Don't share it with anyone. See, everybody just knows their household. No one really knows other households. Human beings, we just know the house we're living in, our spouses, our children. We don't know what's happening in the other ones. So anything we hear, we're going to compare it immediately and judge it. We're going to compare and judge immediately. And you'll know this because if it happens to you, that's what you've done. We've all done this. If you heard something about what's happening in a different household, immediately comparison, judgment. Immediately. Oh, you heard that for a first man. Oh, you heard that this person's wife does this for him. Now he sits there. He compares, he judges immediately. Women do this even worse. Like women are even like more extreme on this. So he does this, khalas. Now you come in the house, she's upset, you don't even know why she's upset. She can't even remember why she's upset because she got upset by this in the early day and that bad mood just stayed to the end of the day and she forgot what upset her at the beginning of the day. And it was something where she heard something about some husband doing something to some wife in some small village somewhere in Timbuktu and it bothered her because you're not doing it. So now so when you hear something about some other family, you compare, you judge. So you don't want to do that. So the more you keep these, so what social media doing today is an absolute, it's one of the signs of Armageddon. Like human beings who are putting on live feed, showing everyone what's happening inside their homes. Are you insane? Are you absolutely insane, Jannah? What are you doing? This is your private life. No one should know what's happening inside. And you as a person, you should not be trying to find that out. Like no one should be following these people. It shows you how messed up what we're doing right now is. The fact that people are actually exposing the confidentialities of their private lives, and that the fact that people are sitting there watching and listening. Yeah, this is not how things are going to happen. So the Prophet ﷺ was interested just to fix that piece. That no, what's confidential has to stay confidential. We can't have that. But he didn't tell her that, by the way, I know that you made up that story for the thing. They found out that he knew when they prayed Isha behind him one night and he recited Surat Al-Tahrim. So that wasn't a very nice. I mean, take it from the perspective of Aisha and Hafsa. But he didn't. Why? Because of his adab, alayhi salatu wasalam. This is the adab of his character, and this is what we're supposed to learn from him. That you don't always, it's not about being right. As much as you think it is in marriage. It's not about being right. The people in the marriage who are always right end up alone. Right? Most of the time. Like if you're always right and you're very adamant on being right, yeah, you'll be right and alone. Totally alone. Sitting alone. You're right, but you're alone. Tell me how much you enjoy being right when you're alone. Tell me. Once you're coming, tell me how good does it feel to be right when you're sitting completely alone and no one. You don't have to be right all the time. That's not the point. The point is to be functional. The point is to be compassionate. The point is for there to be love within this relationship. And yes, when something needs to be pointed out as a mistake and it's important, it's going to affect the functionality, it's going to affect the sanctity. Point it out. The Prophet ﷺ heard the story. They did this piece, fine. They felt a bit jealous or upset, no problem. I don't need to address that. There's no point in addressing that. There's no point in addressing that. If your wife feels upset because you spend so much time with someone or not as much with her, don't address that. That's her loving you. That's her loving you. That's how she knows how to do it. It sucks, I know, but that's what she does. That's how she loves you. Trying to fix it is not going to take you anywhere. Trying to point out that this is wrong and you were wrong and it doesn't help. Yeah, that's how she felt. Fine. You let that piece go. For the Prophet ﷺ, the only piece that he pointed out was the fact that no, whatever is confidential has to stay confidential. You can't go spreading. What I talk to you about, what I tell you, this is a secret. You have to keep it. You can't set someone else. So that was more of an educational piece to keep the house functional. The other one was just for him to be right. I don't know if I could have done what he did, alayhi salatu wasalam. I'll be honest with you. I put myself in his position in this story like a million times. Almost every time, the first thing I was going to do is, what? You did what? My breath stunk, huh? That's what you came up with. And I tried multiple times to change I couldn't. Every single time. That's the first thing I want to say. The first thing that comes to my feeling is you told me that that's what you said. You're plotting behind my back. He didn't bring it up. He had no interest in it. It's the Quran that came and said, وَإِذْ أَسَرَّ النَّبِيُّ فَعَرَّفَ بَعْضَهُ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ بَعْضٍ فَلَمَّا نَبَّأَهَا بِهِ قالت من أنبأك هذا. And when the Quran, when he exposed this, alayhi salatu wasalam, she said, his wife, من أنبأك, who told you all this? قال نبأني العليم الخبير. The one who told me is the omniscient and the khabir. You see, Alim and Khabir are two names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that are very similar. Al-Alim, the omniscient, the all-knowing, the one who knows all. Al-Khabir, the one who knows that which exists inside the heart that is not documented yet. Right? So Sami' in terms of hearing voices, verbal sounds. Al-Basir, seeing things happening. Al-Latif, things that are very small and delicate. Al-Khabir, just the intentions and the whims and something's not physical. It exists inside the soul that has no physicality to it. It's something it's not a thing yet. It's just a thought, it's a feeling, it's a desire, it's a whim, it's a fear. That's what it is. He's Al-Khabir. So he knew what you were doing. قال نبأني العليم الخبير سبحانه صلى الله عليه وسلم. He was talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these are the three, there's many more obviously in these verses that I'm not doing them their justice, but these are the three main lessons of these first verses, organizing some relationships here within a household. Number one, be very careful what you give up. Be very, very careful of what you give up within society, within your relationship. It's important to compromise. It's important to make the other person happy, but be careful of what you give up. Don't give up things unnecessarily, and don't want your spouse to do that, because if you're okay with that, then you are carrying a burden that's not fair, and that will turn into something that will ruin a beautiful thing. Like, it'll ruin a beautiful marriage when you allow someone else to give up something that's important to them that they don't need to give it up. That's halal. There's really no reason for them to give it up. Make sure that you respect confidentiality in your relationship. Keep things that are private. Keep them within the household. Keep it contained. Deal with it internally. Don't spread your secrets, and don't allow people to have access into the privacy of your home, even if they're parents. Actually, I say especially if you're parents. Especially these days. Keep them out. Yeah, I don't know. This is my experience. 90% of the time, the parents just make it worse. 90% of the time, I can fix the problem if the mother and the father just get out of the room. So I can just talk to the two people because they want to make it work. It's just there's so much that gets involved. So keep things confidential. The third piece is, it's not about being right. It's not about being right. It's about being compassionate. It's about being loving. It's about knowing what matters. It's about understanding the other person's angle, knowing where they're coming from, and letting things go when you can. When it's not that important, let it go. People appreciate that. When I make a mistake and I'm not held to it, I appreciate that. I'll remember that that day I was wrong and she didn't say anything. Let it go. She didn't rub it in my face. Didn't come. It means something. Both feel that. It's not about being right. It's about feeling that, making sure that the household stays functional. Point out what needs to be pointed out. But what can be let go, let it go. I'll end with that, inshallah ta'ala. We'll continue the recitation of the surah this surah next week. Subhanallahi wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala